No, it cannot be. I buried you with my own two hands, Eleanor. I buried you 10 years ago.
You buried a body, Edmund. You never buried me.
Every town keeps one story it never says out loud. In the town of Ashwood, that story had a name, and for 10 years, that name was only spoken in whispers, behind closed shutters, over cold suppers, in the second before a candle was blown out for the night. It was the name of a woman everyone believed was dead, a woman a man had loved so completely that when she vanished, he did the only thing his grief allowed him to do. He buried her. He mourned her. He built the rest of his life around the shape of her absence. And then, 10 years later, on an ordinary evening, with no warning and no mercy, she knocked on his door. 3 knocks. A pause long enough to make his heart stop. And then her voice, older now, but exactly as he remembered it, asking him a single question he had spent a decade praying he would never have to answer. Before we go further, you need to understand something. Nothing about this story is what it first appears to be. Not the death, not the grave, not even the man who buried her. This is the story of Edmund Ashford, a landowner's son from a quiet corner of old Ashwood, a town where matters of honor were settled not with pistols or rifles but with steel, the way disputes had been settled by his father's father before him. It is the story of Eleanor Whitfield, the woman he loved, the woman the entire town buried in their hearts long before any coffin was lowered. And it is the story of Marcus Graves, a man whose name you will come to know well, and whose intentions were never what they seemed on the surface. 3 questions will follow you through everything that comes next. First, if Eleanor Whitfield did not die that night, what actually happened to her for 10 long years? Second, who truly stood to gain from letting an entire town believe a lie? And third, what was hidden inside that sealed room in the Ashford house? The room that generations later would be found by a stranger who had no idea what he was walking into. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Now, let's go back to where it all began. To understand what happened to Eleanor Whitfield, you first have to understand what Ashwood was like before any of this happened. It was not a large town. It sat in a valley between 2 ridgelines, far enough from the nearest city that news arrived late and rumors arrived early. Families here did not measure their worth in coin alone, but in land, in name, and in the marriages that bound one family's future to another's. The Ashfords were one of the oldest names in the valley. Edmund was the only son of a respected but quietly struggling household, a young man known less for wealth and more for the steadiness of his character. He was not the loudest man in any room, but he was often the most trusted, and in a town like Ashwood, trust was worth more than land. Eleanor Whitfield, on the other hand, belonged to a family that had recently begun to rise. Her father had built a modest fortune trading grain and timber, and Eleanor herself was known throughout the valley for a sharpness of mind that unsettled some of the older townsfolk and delighted almost everyone her own age. She read more than most men in Ashwood, she asked questions no one else dared to ask aloud, and she had a habit of looking directly at people when she spoke to them, as though she were daring them to lie to her. Ashwood was governed by customs that had not changed in nearly a century. Disputes over land were settled by the magistrate's ledger, but disputes over honor, over accusations too personal for any court to weigh fairly, were settled the old way, with steel, in the open square, before witnesses who would carry the outcome forward as truth for the rest of their lives. Every boy in the valley grew up understanding this, the way children elsewhere grow up understanding the rules of a schoolyard game. It was not seen as barbaric by the people who lived it. It was seen as honest, a system where a man's body could not lie the way his tongue sometimes could. What almost no one in Ashwood ever considered was what might happen if a man learned to use that same system not to reveal the truth, but to bury it more completely than any grave ever could. Edmund and Eleanor had known each other since childhood, the way most people in a small valley did. But it was not until Edmund returned from 3 years of apprenticeship in a neighboring county that something between them changed. He came back taller, quieter, and carrying himself with the kind of restraint that only comes from having been away long enough to miss something, without knowing exactly what it was. Eleanor noticed the change before anyone else did. Within a year, the two of them were rarely seen apart, walking the tree line at the edge of the Whitfield property, arguing cheerfully about books neither of them had actually finished, and sitting for hours on the low stone wall that separated their family's land, a wall that would later become something of a landmark in this story. Their engagement was announced the following spring, and for a brief, golden season, it seemed as though Ashwood had found its happy ending early. But every story like this one has a third figure, and in Ashwood, that figure was Marcus Graves. Marcus came from money older than the Whitfields and nearly as old as the Ashfords, but he lacked the one thing both families had in abundance, which was the quiet respect of the people around him. Marcus had courted Eleanor a full year before Edmund returned from his apprenticeship, and by most accounts, Eleanor had never given him real encouragement, only the polite tolerance a young woman in a small town extends to any suitor she does not wish to embarrass publicly. When Edmund and Eleanor's engagement was announced, Marcus did not react with the grace the town expected of him. He smiled at the celebration, raised his glass with the others, and said all the right things. But those who knew him well, and there were fewer of those than Marcus liked to believe, noticed that something in him had gone very quiet and very cold. It is worth remembering, as this story unfolds, that the men who smile the widest at a wedding are not always the ones who are happiest to be there. The night the engagement was celebrated, the whole valley gathered at the Whitfield property for a supper that lasted well past midnight, and it was there, according to several who attended, that Marcus Graves first revealed something of himself he had kept hidden until then. He approached Eleanor near the edge of the gathering, away from the lanterns, and asked her, in a voice pitched low enough that only she and one passing servant girl overheard it, whether she was certain she was choosing the right man simply because he had returned home first. Eleanor did not answer him. She simply walked back toward the light, toward Edmund, and said nothing of the exchange to anyone for years. The servant girl who overheard it mentioned it to no one either, assuming it was simply the bitterness of a disappointed suitor, the kind of thing every wedding produces at least once. It would be nearly a decade before anyone understood that single quiet sentence for what it actually was, which was a warning no one had known to take seriously. There was also the matter of the Ashford family's finances, a detail few in the valley discussed openly, but everyone quietly understood. Edmund's father had made poor investments in the years before his death, trusting a shipping venture that failed to return even half of what had been promised, and by the time Edmund came of age, the family's land was worth far more than the coin actually sitting in its accounts. Marcus, whose own family had weathered no such misfortune, made a point of mentioning this whenever the topic of the wedding arose, always framed as concern, always delivered with the practiced gentleness of a man who wanted witnesses to remember he had said it kindly. It cost Marcus nothing to plant these small seeds of doubt in the months before the wedding, and he understood, better than almost anyone in Ashwood, that seeds like these do not need tending. They only need time and patience, both of which Marcus Graves had learned to hold on to far better than anyone around him realized. In the months that followed the engagement, small things began to shift in Ashwood that no one thought to connect at the time. A prized hunting blade of Edmund's father's went missing from the house and was never found. A letter Eleanor had written to a cousin in another town arrived weeks late and looked, by her own account, as though it had been opened and resealed. Marcus began spending unusual amounts of time near the Whitfield property, always with some reasonable explanation ready, always seen by just enough people to make his presence feel innocent. None of this raised real alarm at the time. It is only when you look back at Ashwood in those final months before the wedding that you begin to see the shape of something taking form beneath the surface, something patient, something deliberate, something that had already decided how this story was going to end. 2 nights before the wedding, the Whitfield family hosted a smaller supper for both households, the kind of gathering meant to smooth over the last nerves before a ceremony rather than celebrate anything new. Marcus had not been invited, a fact he mentioned to more than one neighbor in the days that followed, always with the same wounded, understanding smile. Eleanor spent much of that evening quieter than usual, and Edmund would later recall, in the single account he ever gave of that week, that she had seemed distracted, glancing more than once toward the window as though she expected to see someone standing in the dark beyond it. When he asked her what troubled her, she told him only that she had seen Marcus near the tree line twice that week, and that something about the way he had looked at her had unsettled her more than she wanted to admit. Edmund offered to speak with Marcus directly. Eleanor asked him not to, certain that it would only make the final days before their wedding uglier than they needed to be. It was a small decision, made out of nothing but a desire for peace, and it would haunt Edmund for the rest of his life. The wedding was set for the first week of autumn, when the harvest was in, and the valley could afford 3 days of celebration, without anyone going hungry over it. In the 2 weeks before the ceremony, Edmund and Eleanor were, by every account left behind, happier than either of them had ever been. Eleanor had taken to walking to the Ashford house in the early evenings, often alone, a habit her father disapproved of but never forbade outright. It was on one of these evenings, according to the only surviving account of that night, that everything began to unravel. Eleanor left her father's house a little after sunset, telling the household staff she intended to walk the tree line toward the Ashford property, as she had done 100 times before. She never arrived. When Edmund realized she was late, he assumed at first that she had simply lost track of time, as she often did when she brought a book with her on these walks. An hour passed, then two. By the time full dark had settled over the valley, Edmund had gathered a lantern and gone looking for her himself, walking the same path she always took, calling her name into the trees. The valley at night was not a place people wandered lightly, and every sound, every snapped branch and shifting shadow, felt to Edmund in that hour like a warning he could not yet name. He would later say that the silence that evening was the worst part, a silence so complete that his own voice calling her name seemed to disappear the moment it left his mouth, swallowed whole by trees that gave nothing back. What Edmund found at the low stone wall between the two properties, he would later describe only once, to a single person, and never in full. There was blood on the stones. Not a great deal, but enough. There was a torn piece of fabric from Eleanor's shawl, caught on the wall's rough edge. And there was Eleanor herself, lying still in the grass just beyond it, her eyes closed, her skin cold to the touch, showing no sign of breath that Edmund in his panic could detect. Beside her, half hidden in the dark, lay a blade Edmund recognized immediately. It was his father's hunting sword, the one that had gone missing from the Ashford house months earlier. What happened in the hour that followed is the part of this story that has been argued over for generations. By Edmund's own account, given only once and reluctantly, he believed with absolute certainty that Eleanor was dead. He had seen death before, in the way any young man of that era had, and everything about her told him the same terrible thing. In his grief, and in a decision he would spend the rest of his life questioning, Edmund did not go to the magistrate. He did not raise the alarm. Instead, driven by a fear he could barely explain even to himself, a fear that whoever had done this might still be watching, might still be close, he carried Eleanor's body back to his family's house under cover of darkness and placed her in a small stone chamber beneath the eastern wing, a room built decades earlier by his grandfather as a storm shelter, a room almost no one outside the Ashford family knew existed. He sealed the entrance with a false section of wall paneling, a trick his grandfather had taught him as a boy, half a game at the time, never once imagined for a purpose like this. And then Edmund did something that would define the rest of his life. He told no one what he had found, not Eleanor's father, not the magistrate, not even his own mother. He let the valley believe that Eleanor Whitfield had simply vanished, because in his grief and his fear, he had convinced himself that the truth would only bring more danger, that whoever had attacked her might come for him next if they knew what he had seen, and that the one thing he could still do for her was keep her safe, even in death, in a place only he knew existed. For 3 days, Ashwood searched every field, every barn, every stretch of river for Eleanor Whitfield, and found nothing, because there was nothing left to find where they were looking. Walter Whitfield walked the tree line himself each morning before the search parties arrived, unable to sit still in his own house, and it was during one of these solitary walks that he first noticed Edmund's absence from the search, entirely on its second day, a detail he mentioned to no one at the time but would recall with a very different weight once the accusations began. Edmund, in truth, had spent that second day locked in his own private torment, sitting for hours beside the sealed wall of the stone chamber, unable to bring himself to open it again, telling himself that grief alone was reason enough to stay away from a search he already knew would find nothing. On the 4th day, Marcus Graves came forward to the magistrate with an account of his own. He claimed he had seen Edmund and Eleanor arguing bitterly near the stone wall 2 nights before her disappearance, an argument he said had grown loud enough to hear from the road. He claimed Edmund had been seen afterward carrying something heavy toward the Ashford house under cover of darkness, though he was careful, so very careful, never to say outright what he believed that something was. He never once accused Edmund directly. He simply placed one small stone after another in front of the magistrate, and let the weight of them speak for him. The town did the rest of the work on its own. Within a week, the story that spread through Ashwood was not a question but a conclusion. That Edmund Ashford, in a fit of jealous rage no one had ever seen in him before, had killed the woman he was set to marry, and hidden her body somewhere no one would ever find it. The town did the rest of the work on its own. Within a week, the story that spread through Ashwood was not a question but a conclusion. That Edmund Ashford, in a fit of jealous rage no one had ever seen in him before, had killed the woman he was set to marry, and hidden her body somewhere no one would ever find it. When the magistrate summoned Marcus a second time to clarify his account, Marcus added one further detail he claimed to have only just remembered, that he had seen Edmund carrying a shovel toward the eastern wing of his family's house that same night, a detail impossible for anyone to confirm or deny, since no shovel was ever found, and no one else claimed to have seen it. It did not matter. By then, the town had already decided which version of events it preferred to believe, and a single unverified detail from a grieving, sympathetic friend of the family was enough to seal it in the minds of nearly everyone who heard it repeated at market the following morning. Edmund never spoke a word in his own defense that named the sword, the wall, or the room beneath his family's house. He could not explain what he had done without admitting where Eleanor's body now lay, and some fractured, grief-broken part of him still believed, against all reason, that speaking her hiding place aloud would somehow bring the danger he feared back to her door. Even now, even in death. So he said nothing, and in a town that ran on trust more than law, saying nothing was very nearly the same as confessing everything. The old customs of Ashwood still held sway over matters like this one, older than any written law in the valley. When accusation could not be settled by evidence, it was settled by combat. A duel fought not for glory but for truth, the belief being that a guilty man's hand would betray him under the weight of what he carried. Eleanor's father, broken by grief and hungry for someone to answer for it, formally challenged Edmund before the whole town square, and by tradition, Edmund had the right to name a champion to stand in his place if he could find one willing. He found no one. Even his closest friends, men who had known him their whole lives, would not raise a blade in his defense against a father burying his only daughter. Edmund would have to fight alone, and somewhere in the crowd that gathered to watch, Marcus Graves stood perfectly still, his expression carefully arranged into something that almost looked like grief. On the morning of the duel, Edmund's mother begged him to name a champion one final time, even offering to approach families the Ashfords had helped in years past, believing someone might still be persuaded to stand for him. Edmund refused her. He told her, in the only words he allowed himself on the matter that day, that if the valley believed he deserved to answer for Eleanor's disappearance with his own body, then he would not hide behind another man's blade to avoid it. It was not confidence that carried him into that square. Those who watched closely would later say it looked far more like a man submitting to a punishment he half believed he deserved, not for murder, but for the silence he had chosen instead of the truth. The duel took place on a gray morning, at the edge of the town square, with half of Ashwood watching in silence. Walter Whitfield was not a young man, but grief had given him a strength that surprised everyone who watched him raise his blade that day. Edmund, for his part, did not fight to win. Those who were there that morning would say for years afterward that Edmund Ashford fought like a man who wanted to lose, parrying only enough to survive, never once pressing an advantage he clearly had. In the end, it was the magistrate who called the duel before it could end in death, ruling that Edmund had shown neither the guilt nor the violence the town expected from a killer, and that the matter would instead be settled by exile rather than blood. Edmund was given 3 days to leave the valley and never return. His family standing in Ashwood reduced overnight to little more than a cautionary tale told to children about jealousy and pride. What almost no one in Ashwood considered, in all the years that followed, was the simplest explanation of all, that perhaps nothing about that night had happened the way the town had decided to believe. Edmund's exile took him first to a port town 2 counties south where no one knew his name or his family's disgrace, and where he took work as a laborer on the docks, a life so far removed from the one he had been raised for that some who knew him in later years never once suspected he had been raised a landowner's son at all. He wrote no letters home, believing that anyone connected to him remained somehow in danger from whatever had truly happened to Eleanor. He carried the guilt of his silence the way some men carry an old injury, rarely mentioning it, never quite free of it. And those who worked alongside him for years would later describe him only as a quiet, careful man who never spoke of his past and never asked others about theirs. In the weeks after Edmund's exile, a traveling healer named Agatha Combs passed briefly through a village 2 valleys away, a woman known for tending to injuries other physicians had already given up on. Villagers there would later recall, though none of them understood the significance at the time, that Agatha had taken in a young woman found unconscious near the old trade road, a woman with a wound to the head and no memory of her own name. Agatha nursed her back to health over the following months, and when the young woman finally woke with her memory intact, she was told a story carefully constructed for her, that she had been the victim of a robbery on the road, injured and left for dead, with no family anyone could locate to claim her. That young woman was Eleanor Whitfield, though she would not learn her own true name again for nearly a decade. Agatha gave her a new name to use in the village, something simple and unremarkable, and taught her the healer's trade alongside her own daughters. Partly out of kindness, and partly, Agatha would later admit, because the girl asked more thoughtful questions about the human body than anyone she had trained in 20 years. Eleanor settled into that life with a quiet, guarded gratitude, never quite able to explain, even to herself, why certain things unsettled her more than they should, why the sight of a low stone wall could stop her cold in the middle of an ordinary afternoon, why a particular shade of autumn light sometimes left her strangely close to tears. She built friendships in that village. She learned to read faster than she once had, driven by some instinct she never questioned to fill the empty spaces in her own mind with other people's stories, since her own remained locked somewhere she could not reach. For nearly a decade, she believed, as everyone around her believed, that this quiet, borrowed life was simply the only one she had. It is worth noting that Ashwood did, for a brief period roughly a year after Edmund's exile, entertain another theory entirely. A traveling merchant who had passed through the valley the same week Eleanor disappeared became the subject of quiet suspicion after it was learned he had a record of minor thefts in a neighboring county. The magistrate's office spent nearly 2 months attempting to locate him again, following rumors of his whereabouts as far as the coast, only to find, when he was finally located, that he had been nowhere near Ashwood on the night in question, and could prove it through 3 separate witnesses. The theory collapsed as quickly as it had formed, but it served, however briefly, to further cement in the town's mind that the mystery of Eleanor's disappearance was a puzzle worth solving, rather than a story someone in their midst had already finished writing. No one thought to look twice at Marcus Graves during those 2 months. He had, after all, been the one who suggested the traveling merchant's name to the magistrate in the first place. The role Marcus Graves played in what actually happened at the stone wall that night has taken the whole of this story to untangle, but the evidence, once you assemble it, does not point toward Edmund at all. Marcus had followed Eleanor that evening, driven by a jealousy he had nursed quietly for over a year, and confronted her at the wall, demanding she reconsider her engagement. When she refused him, plainly and without the softness he felt entitled to, something in Marcus broke in a way the whole valley would come to regret. He struck her, more violently than he intended, and when she fell and did not rise, panic did to Marcus exactly what grief had done to Edmund only moments later. He fled the scene before Edmund ever arrived, leaving the stolen sword behind him in his haste, never imagining that the very blade he had taken to frighten Eleanor into silence would become the evidence that condemned an innocent man in his place. For 10 years, Ashwood told itself a story about a jealous young man and a body that was never found. And for 10 years, that story protected the one person who actually deserved to be standing where Edmund once stood. Marcus Graves did not simply escape suspicion, he inherited from it. With Edmund gone and the Ashford name disgraced, Marcus positioned himself over the following years as a steady, sympathetic presence in Walter Whitfield's life, offering comfort to a grieving father in a way that slowly, carefully, without ever appearing to seek it, elevated his own standing in the valley. He took over management of a portion of the Whitfield land 2 years after Eleanor's disappearance, presented as a favor to an aging man who could no longer manage it alone, and by the 7th year, Marcus had married into a respected family from the far side of the valley, a union that further cemented his place among Ashwood's most trusted voices. He sat on the same council that had once ruled on Edmund's fate, and more than once, in later years, offered gentle counsel to other young men in the valley about the dangers of letting jealousy get the better of good judgment, a lesson he delivered, by every account, with the calm authority of a man who had simply learned it the hard way by watching someone else's downfall. By the 5th year after Eleanor's disappearance, Marcus had become one of the most trusted men in Ashwood, precisely because the town believed he had lost almost as much as the Whitfields had, a dear friend taken from him by another man's rage. Long after Ashwood itself had changed hands and generations, the Ashford house passed quietly through a series of owners who knew nothing of what had happened within its walls, until it fell into disrepair and sat empty for the better part of 2 decades. It was in this state that a man named Nathaniel Hale first saw it, drawn to the property by nothing more than its price and the promise of restoring something old with his own 2 hands. Nathaniel knew none of Ashwood's history when he signed the papers. He only knew that the eastern wing of the house had a wall that sounded strange when he knocked on it, hollow in a way the rest of the house was not. It took him 3 full weekends to work up the nerve to actually open it, partly out of caution about the house's old structure, and partly, if he was honest with himself, out of a quiet unease he could not fully explain, the same instinct that makes a person hesitate before opening a door in an empty house even when they know no one is behind it. When he finally pried the paneling loose on a Sunday afternoon with nothing but a crowbar and a work lamp, the air that met him was cool and still in a way that felt older than the rest of the house, undisturbed by decades of seasons that had changed everything around it. Inside, he found no answers at first, only questions, a small collection of preserved belongings wrapped carefully as though someone had once intended to return for them, and the beginning of a story he had no idea he had just inherited. Eleanor's memory did not return all at once. Agatha Combs would tell her, years later, that it came back in fragments, a smell, a sound, the particular blue of a certain autumn sky, each one surfacing without warning and disappearing again just as quickly. It was not until nearly 9 years after that night at the stone wall that a full memory finally held its shape long enough for Eleanor to trust it. A memory of a hand striking her, a voice she recognized instantly, and a name she had not spoken aloud in almost a decade. Marcus Graves, not Edmund, Marcus. Agatha Combs was the first person Eleanor told, and by Agatha's own later account, she had feared this exact memory returning for years without ever saying so aloud. Agatha admitted, once the truth was finally out in the open, that she had long suspected the young woman she had nursed back to health carried a past far heavier than a simple robbery on the road. But she had never pressed for details she was not certain the girl was ready to face, believing that some memories return only when a person has grown strong enough to survive them a second time. When Eleanor finally described what she remembered, the hand at the wall, the voice she recognized, Agatha did not react with shock so much as a quiet, weary sadness, the look of a woman who had half expected this exact ending for a very long time. What Eleanor pieced together in the months that followed was not simply the identity of the man who had struck her. It was the full shape of what he had allowed to happen afterward, the silence he had kept while an innocent man was exiled from his own home, the comfort he had offered a grieving father while knowing exactly why that grief existed, and the quiet, patient way he had used 10 years of tragedy to build himself into one of the most respected men in a valley that had no idea what he had actually done. Eleanor understood, with a clarity that frightened even her, that returning to Ashwood meant more than reclaiming her own name. It meant unraveling 10 years of a lie that an entire town had built its trust around. Eleanor spent nearly a full season deciding what to do with what she now knew. Part of her, the part that had built a quiet, anonymous life in Agatha's village over the better part of a decade, wondered whether it might be simpler, even kinder, to leave the past exactly where it lay. Edmund had likely rebuilt some version of a life by now, as had she. Marcus had a decade of standing in the valley that would not survive the truth. But the longer she sat with the memory, the harder it became to justify her own silence, especially knowing that somewhere in that valley, an innocent man had spent 10 years carrying a guilt that was never his to carry. It was that thought, more than any desire for revenge, that finally moved her hand to paper. Before she returned to Ashwood itself, Eleanor wrote a single letter and had it delivered by a merchant traveling through the valley, addressed not to her father, not to the magistrate, but to Edmund Ashford himself, wherever he could be found. It took the letter nearly 4 months to reach him, in the small coastal town where he had rebuilt a quiet, unremarkable life under a shortened version of his own name. The letter said very little. It said that she was alive. It said that she remembered what had truly happened. And it asked him a single question, whether he still wanted the truth known, even after everything it had already cost him. Edmund did not answer the letter. He simply began the long walk back toward the valley he had sworn he would never see again. It was during this same stretch of time that Nathaniel Hale, working alone through the eastern wing of his newly purchased house, uncovered the full contents of the hidden chamber his predecessors had sealed away. Among the preserved belongings, wrapped carefully in oiled cloth exactly as Edmund had left them a decade earlier, Nathaniel found a small leather journal, its final pages describing, in Edmund's own uneven handwriting, the night at the stone wall in more honest detail than Edmund had ever given the magistrate. The journal did not accuse Marcus Graves by name, since Edmund himself never truly knew who had struck Eleanor that night, but it described everything Edmund had seen, everything he had feared, and the decision he had made to protect a woman he believed already lost to him. Reading it, Nathaniel realized he was holding the only honest account of a story the entire valley had gotten wrong for generations. When Edmund finally returned to the valley, older, quieter, still carrying the same restraint that had once made him one of the most trusted young men in Ashwood, it was not the magistrate he sought first, and it was not Eleanor's father. It was Marcus Graves, now a respected elder of the town, comfortable in a position of trust he had spent 10 years carefully constructing. Edmund did not come seeking a duel. He came seeking a confession, and he brought with him the one thing Marcus had never accounted for in 10 years of careful silence: a witness who was supposed to be dead. When Eleanor herself walked into that room behind Edmund, whole and utterly unwilling to be quiet any longer, Marcus Graves understood in a single terrible instant that the story he had built his entire second life upon had just ended. Edmund arrived at Marcus's door in the late afternoon, a time of day he chose deliberately, believing correctly that Marcus would be less likely to react violently with the street still busy outside his window. Marcus greeted him with the same practiced warmth he had shown the entire valley for 10 years, an expression that faltered only slightly when he saw the journal in Edmund's hand. He invited Edmund inside anyway, perhaps believing, even then, that his composure alone could carry him through whatever accusation was coming. It was a belief that had served him well for a decade. It would not survive the next several minutes. Marcus Graves did not confess. In the moment Eleanor stood before him, alive and unwilling to be silenced, something in him reverted to the same panic that had started this entire story 10 years earlier at the stone wall. He denied everything, calmly at first, then with a rising desperation that drew the attention of neighbors passing near his home. When Edmund refused to back down, when Eleanor herself began repeating, calmly and clearly, the memory that had finally returned to her in full, Marcus did the one thing that would ultimately undo him completely. He reached for his blade, the same instinct that had once destroyed a young woman's future rising in him again, this time in full view of witnesses who had no reason left to protect him. Edmund had come to that house unarmed. He had told himself, all the way back through the valley, that this confrontation would be settled with words, and with the journal in his coat pocket, nothing more. It was Eleanor who moved first, when Marcus lunged, placing herself between the two men, with a fearlessness that stunned everyone watching, including Marcus himself. In the brief, chaotic struggle that followed, Marcus stumbled backward over the threshold of his own doorway, his blade turning against him in the fall, in a way no one present could call anything but an accident, though more than one witness that day quietly wondered afterward whether some form of justice had simply run out of patience. The wound was not immediately fatal, and in the hours before he died, with the valley's actual magistrate finally present to hear it, Marcus Graves said more than he had said in 10 years of careful silence. He admitted to striking Eleanor at the stone wall. He admitted to fleeing the scene and saying nothing while an innocent man was tried in his place. He admitted, in a voice the magistrate later described as strangely calm, that he had told himself for a decade that his silence was not truly a lie, only an omission, a distinction that had let him sleep at night for years longer than it should have. He did not survive until morning, and Ashwood was left to reckon with the uncomfortable truth that the man they had trusted most in the years since Eleanor's disappearance was the one man who had never deserved that trust at all. News of what had truly happened spread through Ashwood far faster than the original accusation ever had, though this time it moved through the valley with none of the certainty that had condemned Edmund a decade earlier. People who had once nodded along at Marcus's careful stories now found themselves re-examining every kind word he had ever offered, every comforting visit to the Whitfield house, every quiet suggestion he had planted about the traveling merchant, or the shovel no one had ever found. Some in the valley took it hard, ashamed of how easily they had been led. Others insisted they had always harbored some small doubt, a claim history has heard many times before and rarely believes. Edmund's name was formally restored within the month, the old ruling of exile struck from the town record by the same magistrate's office that had issued it. But restoration, as Edmund would say himself in the only interview he ever gave about that period of his life, is not the same thing as returning to what was lost. 10 years cannot be given back simply because the truth finally arrives. Edmund and Eleanor did marry, quietly, in the same valley that had once turned against them both, and they lived out the remainder of their years in Ashwood, though neither of them ever spoke easily about the decade that had been taken from them. Walter Whitfield lived just long enough to see his daughter's name cleared, and by every account he spent his final years deeply and silently ashamed of how quickly he had believed the worst of the young man his daughter had loved. Centuries later, standing in the same eastern wing where all of it had once been hidden, Nathaniel Hale finished cataloging the contents of the chamber he had found, entirely by accident. Beneath the journal, wrapped separately in a small square of cloth that had survived far better than anything else in that room, he found a simple ring, clearly old, clearly never worn, exactly the kind a young man might have commissioned for a woman he intended to marry that autumn. Edmund had never given it to her. He had sealed it away instead, alongside everything else from that night, unable to look at it again without remembering what it had cost him. Nathaniel spent the following months tracing whatever remained of the Ashford and Whitfield family lines through old town records. Not out of obligation, but because it felt to him like the one true room he had inherited. A room that had waited generations to be understood correctly, rather than simply survived. He never claimed to have righted an old wrong. He only felt, standing where Edmund once stood, that some stories deserve to finally be told the way they actually happened, rather than the way a frightened town once decided to believe them. What this story leaves behind is not a clean resolution, and it was never meant to be one. A guilty man died in an accident rather than facing the judgment his crime deserved, and an entire town spent 10 years placing its trust in exactly the wrong person, simply because he was patient enough and comfortable enough to let their assumptions do his work for him. Was justice really served in Ashwood that day? Or did it simply arrive too late to matter to the people who paid for it? And if you had been standing in that valley 10 years earlier, among neighbors who had known Marcus Graves his entire life, would you truly have spotted the quiet, careful signs that Edmund missed? Or would his grief have looked, to you too, exactly like guilt? So tell us in the comments below, honestly, what would you have done in Edmund's place at that stone wall, carrying someone you loved and believed already gone? Would you have trusted the town's judgment, or would you have made the same desperate choice he did? And do you think Ashwood ever truly forgave itself for how quickly it turned on one of its own? Or do towns like this simply move on and let the next season's harvest bury the memory a little deeper each year? Let us know what you think really deserved to happen to Marcus Graves, and whether you believe an accident is ever a fitting substitute for justice. If this story stayed with you, that likely means it did exactly what it was meant to do, because the best of these old, forgotten stories are never really about the past at all. They are about how easily trust can be built on top of a lie, and how long that lie can hold, as long as no one ever thinks to knock on the wrong door. We have another story like this one waiting for you next, one just as quiet, just as patient, and just as far from what it first appears to be, so make sure you are here when it arrives. Subscribe for more real stories like this one, hit that bell so you never miss what comes next, and we will see you very soon.